Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russia hits Ukrainian command post while Ukraine intercepts Russian helicopter. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky thanks United States for military aid package as counter-offensive grinds on. Plus, Russian parliament votes to raise conscription age limit to 30 years of age. Thank you for joining us. Russia's defense ministry says its forces have repelled multiple attacks from the Ukrainian army, while Ukraine claims it intercepts Russian helicopters and drones. That's according to official briefings from both countries on Tuesday. Russia reports that several Ukrainian attacks were repelled by Russian troops in Donetsk, in Krasny Liman, in Zaporozhye, in Kupiansk and Kherson. Directions with Russian forces hitting a Ukrainian command post, ammunition, and counter-battery radar. Now, the defense ministry also said that Russian air defense forces intercepted Ukrainian Mi-24 helicopter, HIMARS rockets, and drones. Meanwhile, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces said they had dozens of battles with Russian troops in many directions over the past 24 hours. Ukrainian forces carried out several airstrikes against points with presence of Russian military personnel and equipment and attacked Russian electronic warfare systems, air defense missile systems, and other targets, and intercepted a Russian Kamov Ka-50 helicopter and several drones. Ukraine's Eastern Forces spokesman, Colonel Serhiy Sherevatel, on Tuesday said that Ukrainian troops have started firing the cluster munitions provided by the United States in the battlefield of Bakhmut. In the meantime, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky is thanking the United States for its latest package of military aid. The U.S. Department of Defense announced $400 million in additional security assistance for Ukraine on Tuesday, July the 25th, including air defense missiles, armored vehicles, and small drones. As Ukraine's counter-offensive against Russia grinds on, President Zelensky also said he had spoken with the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on topics including air defense for Ukraine's Black Sea ports, which have been hit by missile strikes in recent weeks. The U.S. State Department says it's aware that Trevor Reed, a former U.S. Marine who was detained in Russia and then freed in a prisoner swap last year, was injured while fighting in Ukraine. State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel said he was not aware of any communication offered to the U.S. government on Mr. Reed's travel plans to Ukraine. According to Patel, Mr. Reed was transported with the help of an NGO to Germany for medical care. The United States has repeatedly warned Americans not to travel to Ukraine or participate in the fighting, and the State Department's travel advisory for Ukraine warns that there are reports of Russians singling out U.S. citizens in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine for detention, interrogation, and harassment.
We are aware that Trevor Reed was injured while participating in fighting in Ukraine. Since the beginning of this war, we have warned that U.S. citizens who travel to Ukraine, especially with the purpose of participating in fighting there, that they face significant risks, including the risk of capture or death or physical harm as well. And so I want to be explicitly clear about something. Mr. Reed was not engaged in any activities on behalf of the U.S. government. And as I indicated, we have been incredibly clear, warning American citizens, American nationals, not to travel to Ukraine, let alone participate in fighting there. We are not in a place to provide assistance to evacuate private U.S. citizens from Ukraine, including those Americans who may decide to travel to Ukraine to participate in that ongoing war. Now, we are aware that through the support of an NGO, Mr. Reed has been transported to Germany, and he is receiving medical care.
Meanwhile, the White House has clarified that former U.S. Marine who was injured while fighting in Ukraine was not operating on behalf of the U.S. government. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre told reporters the president had been briefed on the case of Trevor Reed, who was detained in Russia and then freed in a prisoner swap in April 2022. Russian lawmakers in the lower house have voted to raise the maximum age at which men can be conscripted from 27 to 30 years, increasing the number of young men liable for a year of compulsory military service at any one time. Last year, Russia announced a plan to boost its professional and conscripted combat personnel by more than 30% to 1.5 million. The new legislation, which comes into effect on January the 1st, means men will be required to carry out a year of military service or equivalent training during higher education between the ages of 18 and 30, rather than 18 and 27 as at now. The law also bans men in Russia from leaving the country from the day they are summoned to a conscription office. In April, legislation was passed allowing conscription summons to be served online instead of in person. Compulsory military service has long been a sensitive issue in Russia, where many men go to great lengths to avoid being handed conscription papers during the twice-yearly call-up for periods. Conscripts cannot legally be deployed to fight outside Russia and were in theory exempted from a limited mobilization last autumn that gathered at least 300,000 men with previous military training to fight in Ukraine, although some conscripts were sent to the front in error. Now, joining us in the studios is Barrister Chukwuemeka Eze, a former lecturer on diplomatic and consular relations law, Faculty of Law, Nasarawa State University, Kefi, but he's with us here physically this morning. Good morning, Barrister Eze. Thank you so much for being with us today, and at that, in person.
Good morning, Olumide. Good morning, Nigerians.
Now, the Ukrainian government have said that they will send a report to the United States on the use of their cluster munitions, which has been heavily criticized and very controversial. But could you give us your thoughts on that, keeping in mind that these munitions, for which they are sending reports to the U.S. on how they are using them, Russia is not held to the same standard. Russia is going to use their own cluster munitions, and they don't have to report to anyone. But for Ukraine to be using these cluster munitions that are so dangerous and so have so many side effects in the long run on your own soil, isn't it the same as cutting off your nose to spite your face?
No, we need to know this, that those in the military circle understands the United States doesn't give you freedom to purchase its weapons. There are always clauses, even in peace times, before you can buy any war material from the United States, either directly or from another country it has supplied to. Usually there is a clause that before that country sells some of those sensitive war equipment and materials, that they will get permission from the United States. Yes, this is real. So it's not a free market. If they sell to Germany or sell to Poland, there might be a clause depending. Recall when Turkey wanted to, had an agreement to produce F-35 aircrafts in Turkey. And there was the coup, and U.S. was accused. Along the line, there was fracture in relationship between Turkey and the United States. I mean, the whole thing came crashing. And in any case, United Arab Emirates have been wanting to buy F-35, the fighters. So usually they don't easily sell. And recall that one of the reasons why Morocco warmed itself with Israel, they now have diplomatic relations, is because United States, so in some circles, that's the position that United States agreed to sell that fighter aircraft to Morocco. So something gives, so bringing it down to Ukraine, if they can do this in peace times, then wonder what they will do in war times. And there is a convention against cluster munitions. Although Ukraine and United States are not members, they are not parties to that convention. Nevertheless, it gets to a point when non-parties to a convention are bound by practice, especially when it gets to what we call jus cogens.
What's
yes, in international law, when a principle of customary law has graduated to war practice, such that even those that are not members are bound. Let me give you an example. During COVID-19, majority of the countries were implementing it, so you couldn't have come out to say, oh, we don't believe in COVID-19, we won't do anything about it. If there is an agreement signed and you refuse to sign, you are bound by the practice.
By default.
Directly by default. Yeah. So basically, Ukraine has been getting the munitions, the cluster munitions, on condition that it will report to the United States. And the United States allies, like Germany, Britain, they are critical of the supply because of the danger to the civilians. Even several years after the war, those cluster munitions, especially those that have not blown up, will continue to do damage to the population.
These humanitarian concerns, aren't they well-founded? Why do you think Ukraine has gone ahead to take this risk that they know inadvertently will affect their own civilian population down the line? We've heard the arguments that Russia, and I just said that in the beginning, Russia is not held to the same standards. Ukraine says Russia has also already used cluster munitions. We've also heard an argument that where they will use those munitions, those areas, the trench warfare areas, are already corrupted by the war. So they're saying, look, we're not going to use them in these populations where civilians are presently will be affected. But is that enough of a reason to go ahead with the venture?
I think it's proper in the circumstance because they lack the air power. And they need munitions that can strike their enemy several kilometers or miles away. So, and do sufficient damage, because it doesn't make sense if you continue to use artillery and your opponent has even more artillery than you. So, although Russia has cluster munitions, but we need to think of, in war, you think of today before you think of tomorrow. So, in as much as it is a terrible thing, but basically they need to survive today and get experts to clear the cluster munitions tomorrow. If they don't survive today, I mean, the dead will not be consumed by the cluster munitions that are refused to blow up in future. So Ukraine will need to survive today.
Let's take an aspect of the counteroffensive now, and let's take the aspect of the Russian offensive against the counteroffensive. They've been accused by Ukraine of destroying historical monuments. There's the Transfiguration Cathedral in Odessa that was damaged, but Russia says that it wasn't them that did it, that it was the Ukrainians that did it. How much of this comes into play where... So they're lying, right? but right, how much does it come into play where they may not be lying? Can they be given the benefit of the doubts? You know, in military terms, at times there's significant negative or failed targets. You're talking about you have to long-range missile targets, long-range artillery targets. At times, their information is wrong, or not accurate, and they hit something else, such as friendly fire when you fire against your own troops in a time of war.
There is something good about what's happening. Some people are there getting records of what is happening, accurate records. Even United Nations agencies, they are getting records. The International Criminal Court, they are getting records because already there is a warrant on hanging like the sword of Damocles on Putin's head. So they will need evidence at the end of the day to take certain actions that they will want to take. So if it is Ukraine that used friendly fire to damage it, we will know in due course. Because in the time of war, falsehood is also a weapon. Yes, in communication. So we may not know the whole truth now. But one thing is clear, you ask yourself, is it Ukraine that is bombing Odessa seaport and Danube seaport? Is it Ukraine? So there is sufficient damage to food. Economic power of Ukraine is being crippled. Vis-a-vis, and you know the obvious implication in the food market, I mean, in the food supply all over the world, because Ukraine still remains, I think, the second highest supplier of wheat, barley, grain, and all that all over the world. So the prices have shot up. Infrastructurally, they are being crippled. Some of their children are being taken to Russia. So, and a third of their territory is already in the hands of Russia. So if Ukraine doesn't get these supplies that it is getting, if it decides to be damaging its own country, it will be worse. So I doubt that Ukraine has bombed Odessa. The architectural, the cultural facets in Odessa, there are many of them. It's not just that cathedral.
World Heritage Sites and
yes.
the like.
UNESCO is already crying out with many. Some of those things have been there for centuries. And definitely going by the Geneva Conventions of 1949, if it is proven at the end of the day, I think Russia will be held to account.
Romania has criticized Russia for that attack on the Danube tributary near the Black Sea.
Yes.
And the Ukrainians say that Russia is deliberately targeting the Ukrainian silos and the storage facilities for Ukrainian grain. As it relates to Africa, Mr. Eze, give us your overview. President Cyril Ramaphosa was heavily criticized on his peace mission for obvious reasons. But now that it has come home to roost, the chickens for Africa with this Black Sea grain deal expiration, and we're already bearing the brunt of it, what's your impression?
My impression from minute one, I knew Ramaphosa was on a jamboree. The reason is this. Ask yourself, what place is Africa in what is happening? Are we giving money? Are we giving weapons?
The grain deal supply.
I know the grain deal supply.
The world is a global village.
It's a global village, but we operate in a ladder. We have a hierarchy. Africa is the least in that hierarchy. So their going there didn't change anything and wouldn't have changed anything. Because in the face of war, South Africa had been blamed of taking side with Russia. And South African National Congress had not hidden its admiration with Russia, even in this war, although sometimes it claims to be neutral. So, but we all know that South Africa is not neutral.
They were partners before the war,
certainly,
so they can't cut them off
but they were,
immediately
they were speaking up. Remember the maneuver, the military maneuver that took place in South Africa?
Yes.
Why did it happen during the war? South Africa should have said, oh, let's suspend this maneuver.
That matter is still under investigation.
Until, no, not the supply, not the supply of weapons.
All right.
I'm talking of the military maneuver.
Right. Okay.
Where China, Russia, they were all there with South Africa.
Yes.
I think in Cape Town, and they did their maneuver and left. So Why is it that during war, in wartime, that South Africa allowed that to happen? And BRICS meeting will be taking place in South Africa. So South Africa is permanently in the news during a time of war against Ukraine. So certainly you should get the impression. And that's why it's leading of that delegation to didn't make any difference. And in any case, if you accuse the Ukrainians of not making a good impression of it, now that Russia is bombing Ukraine, the silos, what is South Africa saying? Is South Africa saying, no, don't bomb it because Africans need this? South Africa is quiet.
Will the Russians listen if they do say anything?
I mean, even if they speak and they don't listen, but the world will know that they spoke out.
Finally, sir, what is your impression and your view on how this war should be, how efforts should continue or now be started up again or restarted for armistice or treaty or a total or a ceasefire of some sort?
I think we'll get to a point that something will give, because if the Korean War that took place between 1950 and 1993, sorry, 1950 to 1953, 3 years, if it could end, this war will end. So although it ended in armistice, no peace agreement was signed, but at least it ended. And the stakes are still being held in the middle up to today. So this war will end, but how it will end, I don't know, because the stakes are very high. Indeed. And the escalation is something else. The devastation is gargantuan. So I really don't know how it will end, but I know it's getting to a point that both sides will get to the table. They must get, if the First World War ended on a table, the Second World War ended on a table. You recall the First World War ended with Germany surrendering, yes, and the Treaty of Lausanne that Turkey, modern Turkey, emerged.
Yes. So
something we give at the end of the day. Let's watch and see how it ends.
We hope those parties rush to this table, and we hope it's a round table. Thank you so much, Barrister Chukwuemeka Eze, for your insight and your contributions this morning on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Speaking to Barrister Chukwuemeka Eze, former lecturer on Diplomatic and Consular Relations, Faculty of Law, Kefi, Nasarawa State University. After the break, Kremlin rejects UN chief's call to return to Black Sea grain deal, but the United Nations pursues efforts to extend the deal. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine today. The United Nations says it continues to pursue efforts to extend the expired Russian grain deal despite Moscow's rebuff. The Kremlin said on Tuesday it was impossible for Russia to return to the Black Sea grain export deal until an agreement related to Russian interests was honored, rebuffing a call by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for Moscow to rejoin. The UN on Monday urged Russia to resume allowing Ukraine to export grain safely from its seaports, despite what Russia calls its special military operation, in line with a proposal he had made to President Vladimir Putin. But the Kremlin suggested Mr. Guterres' proposal did not address its main complaint, that there had been no progress on a related agreement that was designed to facilitate Russian food and fertilizer exports amid Western sanctions imposed in response to the war. The now-defunct deal, brokered by the United Nations and Turkey last July, aimed to help prevent a global food crisis by allowing grain blocked by the war in Ukraine to be safely exported.
Pursue, as we have said, the efforts to make sure that exports of food and fertilizer from both Ukraine and the Russian Federation can proceed. I don't have details on this to give you at this point, but as the Secretary General has made clear, he has not given up on this because it's essential, not just for those two countries, but for the well-being of the world. The UN staff continues their involvement and will keep apprised of any developments. Obviously, we would be concerned about any such mining or other activity. I'm not aware that of any first-hand information of that. No.
In the meantime, the European Union says it is ready to export almost all of Ukraine's farm produce via solidarity lanes and help to cover costs. This was made known by EU Agriculture Commissioner Janusz Wojciechowski after Russia withdrew from a UN-backed Black Sea grain deal. Solidarity lanes are rail and road transport connections through EU member states that border Ukraine, such as Poland and Hungary, while the most significant lane is through Romania. He said that the EU was looking at several initiatives from member states to come up with a joint plan to cover the additional transport costs. Expanding grain transit through the EU is sensitive for Poland and some other EU countries bordering Ukraine, where farmers have come under pressure from increased Ukrainian imports. Now in May, the EU allowed 5 countries close to Ukraine, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, to ban domestic sale of Ukrainian wheat, maize, and oilseeds while allowing transit through them for onward export. The EU will review the ban after several countries push for extension beyond the September the 15th ban expiration date.
We are very worried about this decision, but we are not surprised. This is not the first time that Russia used the food as a weapon, and this decision is also not a surprise, I think, for all of us. This is not attractive enough. The trade using the solidarity lanes by Poland, by Hungary, for example, by Romania. Romania is the biggest transport corridor, but we need to consider the support for the transport. Without of this, there is a risk that Russia will be beneficiary of the situation, because it will be cheaper to buy grain from Russia than to pay for the grain from Ukraine, transported by Poland to the Black Sea, to the Baltic ports. The cost of this operation will be always higher than Russia can offer on the global market.
Now joining us is Professor Rory Finnan, who is joining us from England in Cambridge. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Olumide. Nice to be with you again.
Same here, and thank you so much. Let us begin with these solidarity lanes that the EU says will be an alternative to the Black Sea grain transport route. Will it be enough, or will it be a drop in the ocean compared to the volume of produce that was previously being transported through the Black Sea?
I wouldn't describe it as a drop in the bucket. I do think these are very, very helpful supplementary strategies to combat what is, as the representatives just explained in your previous piece, is a weaponization of food and a weaponization of hunger that, of course, affects the global south in particular. So if we back up once again, we need to understand the broader context of all of this. Not only has Russia, since February 2022, seized parts of Ukrainian sovereign territory, it's also blockaded the Black Sea. And in blockading the Black Sea, it's not allowed the free passage of Ukrainian grain to ports around the world. When the Kremlin has seen that the progress on the front is not to their liking, they use this grain deal, which was struck last July, particularly by the EU, the UN, and Turkey. They use that as leverage to win more concessions. And they're basically holding the world to ransom. And we can see a deliberate strategy here of not only blockading the Black Sea, not allowing for that safe passage of Ukrainian grain to ports around the world, but also we see the Russian forces indeed striking ports in Odessa, hitting the infrastructure that is so key to this export of grain to the continent of Africa in particular. So this is a very cynical weaponization of hunger, and anything that neighboring allies can do to assist Ukraine in exporting this grain is a welcome step. Obviously, it doesn't make up for this massive weaponization of hunger by blockading passage of vessels in the Black Sea, but it's something, and we need to build on it, and at the same time call the Kremlin's bluff, because they've been very much saber-rattling against Poland, Romania, and what we see is usually when Russia does this saber-rattling, when you do stand up to Moscow, they back off. So I think that strategy should be employed here as well.
Could you explain for us, if you will, what this blockading of the Black Sea, how it works? There are about 6 countries bounding the Black Sea, including Bulgaria, Georgia, Poland, I believe, Romania, as well as Turkey and Russia. Is the area the exclusive preserve of, are there certain areas that are the exclusive preserve of Russia that they can blockade ships passing through?
Russia has been seeking to make the Black Sea a quote-unquote Russian lake for a very long time. And what Russia does, and we've seen it repeatedly, is aggressively deploy its armed forces, aggressively through so-called diplomatic channels, project its interests around the world. It intimidates the free passage of vessels in the Black Sea. And we also see through its approaches to destroying Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, as well as the Ukrainian natural environment. So we talked last time about the explosions at the Novokakhovka Dam that swept hundreds and thousands of mines into the Black Sea. So we need to just take a step back and understand that this aggression on the Ukrainian mainland has affected indeed the entire Black Sea, made it extremely dangerous, militarized it in a host of different ways. And NATO countries that indeed, as you said, border the Black Sea are naturally hesitant to provoke Russia, because that would involve, of course, provocation involving NATO forces and Russian forces, which the world is studiously trying to avoid. And Russia uses that to their advantage. They feel as though they can be the aggressor, and getting concessions from other states, as we see with the Black Sea deal itself.
So I want to be clear. In other words, Russia, the other countries that bound the Black Sea have as much right as Russia in the passage of vessels, but Russia is intimidating other countries because they don't want to be, the other countries don't want to be provoked into actions that will lead to war.
Exactly right. I think, we have to understand that when we talk about Russia's control of the Black Sea coast, much of it is post 2014. So when Russia annexed Crimea, they seized the entire peninsula. Prior to that point, they had been leasing space in Sevastopol, the former Soviet closed city, for the Black Sea Fleet. They have since 2014 taken the entirety of Crimea, and now since February 2022 seized a lot of the Black Sea coast of southeastern Ukraine. So when we talk about Russia as this, let's say, Black Sea power, it has been building through its aggressive tactics and illegal measures more control of the Black Sea. And effectively, we're in a position of not wanting to escalate. I mean, the West has been very tepid often with its response to Russian aggression, because it does not want to provoke the Kremlin further, and that only rewards the Kremlin's behavior. And so we're seeing progressively this weaponization and militarization of the Black Sea, which, given its significance geopolitically, is a hugely dangerous prospect for world security.
The Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has taken issue with the decision not to extend the ban of produce sold to farmers in Bulgaria, in Poland, in Slovakia, right? But these farmers have a legitimate concern that these Ukrainian wheat exports and what have you, they're suffering because of it. Now with these solidarity lanes that will go through Poland, it seems to be that it may be an exacerbation of the issue with the farmers. And they are all Ukrainian allies, and they do want the best for Ukraine. So what possible solution can you see that at the end of the day will not hurt these farmers in these countries, as well as continue to support the Ukrainian defense of its country?
It is a very difficult balance. It truly is. And I think, the solidarity lanes, if properly deployed and used to the effect that has been designed, I think there's a way to strike that balance. And, all of this is unprecedented. So these EU allies along the Black Sea are working on an ad hoc basis with Ukraine, with Ukrainian farmers, as you said, who have been courageously continuing with harvest schedules in the midst of full-scale war and in the midst of them being targeted by Russian military force. I mean, it's a very shocking realization that we've begun to normalize after 18 months of this aggressive war waged by the Russian Federation. Farmers, civilians have been the precise target for Russian military force. These strikes on Odessa that deliberately target the port infrastructures on the Black Sea, the mouth of the Danube strikes, as you mentioned earlier in your program, these are all about starving Ukrainian farmers from their right to harvest grain and export it to the world. And so these allies in the EU are simply making things up as they go, and I think constructively and helpfully. But there is a balance between, of course, ensuring their own farmers in Romania, for instance, in Poland, are able to conduct their business and at the same time support Ukrainian farmers too. I think this is a step-by-step process that's going to see some amendments and changes as the process continues.
You mentioned the Odessa strike. Now, you're familiar with the term, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. The Odessa strike was precipitated by the strike on the Crimean bridge, the bridge to Crimea, by Ukraine. And this has led to this tit-for-tat that we've been reporting this morning, up to the extent of Russian helicopters being destroyed and what have you. What's your position?
Well, I wouldn't characterize it as a tit for tat, because you have an aggressor state that's violating the UN Charter, and you have a state that's legally entitled to its self-defense, defending itself. That Crimean bridge is an illegal construction. Crimea is Ukrainian sovereign territory. And it is also a point of passage for weapons into this full-scale war. So it is a strategic asset for the Russian military. Keep in mind that Crimea is not attached to the Russian mainland. It is an extension of the Ukrainian steppe, of the Ukrainian south. So this bridge is the only thing connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland before the full-scale invasion of February 2022, when, of course, Russian forces stormed through Crimea up into Ukraine's south and seized that territory as well. So the Ukrainian military has indeed legally the right to strike this military target that's illegally built on its own territory. And it has every right to defend itself in every single phase of this war. Russian aggression should not be equalized with, I think, Ukrainian self-defense at all.
Would you critique the timing of the strike, therefore, because that was the excuse that the Russians used to, one of the excuses that they used to pull out of the Black Sea grain deal?
They'll find any excuse they want to get more leverage, to bring people to the table. They'll seek to escalate in the hopes that we'll be fearful. They will commit atrocities in the hope that we will shrink away in fear and intimidation. There's not much that this criminal regime in the Kremlin is afraid of doing. And I think we just need to be very clear with our own terms about what's happening in this aggressive war. The strikes against civilian targets are a part of a broader plan to destroy Ukrainian culture and society. And if one watches Russian state television, as unfortunately I do every day, you see this rhetoric dehumanizing Ukrainians, asserting that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people have no place in the world, they don't really exist. This genocidal rhetoric is the rhetoric of a state that had previously talked about Ukraine, particularly in the Soviet period, as a brotherly nation. or as a friend, part of a friendship of peoples. So when we look at the rhetoric of friendship that Russia extends, particularly to African countries, right now at the Russian-Africa Summit, we need to be very suspicious and careful about what that kind of friendship means, because look at the outcome since 2014, and indeed since the full-scale invasion's onset in February 2022. This friendship is nothing more than a potential passage to aggression.
Finally, are you concerned that the Russian Defense Minister Matanov, I believe, Denis Matudov, says that the Russian weapons manufacture capacity, that they make in 1 month more weapons than they made the entire year of last year in this Russian invasion? What does that mean for the plans of the Ukrainian counter-offensive forces and the defense of Ukraine if Russia can muster as much weapons in a month as it did in a year?
I think no one should be underestimating Russian military force and what it's capable of. I reject the rhetoric that Ukrainian victory is somehow taken for granted and on its way. What we need to do is carefully assess and evaluate what's potential from the Russian Federation in terms of military force, and allies who support the right of a sovereign independent country to fight back when it's invaded, that support the right of a military to defend its people when they're subjected to deportation, forced enslavement, murder, torture, that all of those states that believe in such things, that are enshrined in the UN Charter, support Ukraine with the weapons that they're requesting to defend themselves. I think if we fully appreciate the depths to which Russia will descend in terms of provoking global instability, global hunger, crimes against civilians, war crimes in Mali with the Wagner Group, for instance, this butcher's bill, as it were, is something that should cause us to understand very clearly Ukraine needs to be supported through provision of weapons, in particular artillery. And if not, we're going to see the world system, as imperfect as it is, descend into something that is a very naked might makes right type of strategy between states, and that's a very dangerous place for all of us to be in. As you said, this is a global village, as it were. So the Western states really need to step up and provide Ukraine things that they're asking for. I think they've shown over 18 months the kind of restraint and the kind of focus that frankly should cause admiration, given the stakes of this conflict and given how much horrific treatment their civilians have received.
That's plenty of food for thought, Professor. Thank you so much for making out the time to be with us this morning. Professor Rory Finnan of the University of Cambridge, and he's a professor of Ukrainian studies as well. Many thanks.
Thank you.
When we return, Russian military delegation led by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu in North Korea. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Britain has information indicating the Russian military may expand their targeting of Ukrainian grain facilities further to include attacks against civilian shipping in the Black Sea. Britain's UN ambassador Barbara Woodward said Prime Minister Rishi Sunak shared the information with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky during a phone call on Tuesday. The British ambassador shared the United States assessment that Russia intends to blame Ukraine for any attacks against civilian ships in the Black Sea. Prior to Russia pulling out of the deal this month, 60% of Ukraine's exports were shipped via solidarity lanes, while 40% went via the Black Sea.
Now, our information indicates that the Russian military may expand their targeting of Ukrainian grain facilities further to include attacks against civilian shipping in the Black Sea. This morning, Prime Minister Sunak spoke to President Zelensky to share this information with him. Prime Minister Sunak also told President Zelensky that he is appalled by the devastation caused by recent Russian attacks on Odessa, and that the UK is working closely with Turkey and the UN to restore the Black Sea grain deal. Our information also indicates that Russia has laid additional sea mines in the approaches to Ukrainian ports, and we agree with the US assessment that this is a coordinated effort to justify and lay blame on Ukraine for any attacks on civilian ships in the Black Sea. So tomorrow, at the request of Ukraine, the Security Council will once again meet on Russia's escalatory attacks on Odessa and attempts to weaponize global food supplies.
Now, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says it will be important for Russia to discuss grain supplies with African countries at a Russia-Africa summit later this week, especially now that the Kremlin has said it was impossible for Russia to return to the Black Sea grain export deal as an agreement related to Russian interests was not being implemented. Mr. Peskov told journalists that President Vladimir Putin had made it clear that the deal could be revived if the Russia-focused part of the agreement was honored. The deal brokered by the United Nations and Turkey last July aimed to help to prevent a global food crisis by allowing grain blocked by the conflict in Ukraine to be safely exported. And to give us a business perspective on these issues is Laddie Williams, our business correspondent. Laddie, good morning.
Good morning.
This is exactly why there may be hope, a ray of light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
Because Putin has said that it can be revived, it can be resuscitated, like a phoenix from the ashes,
exactly,
if you do what we say. Now, we don't know whether they'll be able to do what Russia says in terms of the export of Russia's grain and fertilizer. But you've mentioned here that the IMF, International Monetary Fund, says that the suspension of this arrangement could raise grain prices by 10 to 15%.
Yeah, which is huge. And you know, last year, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw how, wheat prices, skyrocketed last year. We saw how that impacted, countries that rely heavily on grains coming out of Ukraine and Russia, from North Africa, to Asia, some parts of Asia, even in West Africa too. Even Nigeria, right here, we also depend on, wheat from abroad. But, looking at how it's going now, we've had renewals, from 2022 into 2023, but now we're seeing this tension, right now, and with Russia pulling out of this deal, we've seen the IMF now weighing on the matter, saying that wheat price is going to rise about 10 to 15%. That's a big move up, and definitely that's risking global hunger, at this point, because a lot comes out from Ukraine and Russia, talking about grains, sunflower seed oil, and a lot, like so much, about 60%, they export, to, global buyers at this time. So 10 to 15% jump in price is going to be huge. We already have inflation, that's another headache right now every country is having to deal with. We've seen other countries raise rates, trying to, rein in inflation, but that was stoked by rising energy prices and food prices. So with this 10 to 15% jump, if it happens, that's if we don't get a renewal, anytime soon, it's going to be a big problem for the inflation story,
It's
globally.
interesting that IMF is talking about it now.
Exactly.
For critics of the IMF who say that they're not friends of developing nations,
right,
given the way some of their, you know what they do.
Exactly.
So, why do you think they're interested at this point? Is it because they're assuming that some countries will be turning to the IMF now?
Because exactly, that's going to put pressure on most of these countries. But we're already seeing countries like Egypt, for instance. Yeah. Now we're seeing Egypt. They've ramped up domestic production of wheat. They've been looking ahead, knowing that this deal, anything can happen. Because if they don't give in to Russia's terms at this point, even though some say it's not the hardest thing, just connect there. Do you see countries going cap in hand to the IMF because of this grain deal expiration? It is highly.
Is that why IMF?
Possible.
Are their motives not totally altruistic?
It's possible, because at the end of the day, these countries are dealing with a lot right now. We're seeing rising cost of living everywhere, even right here in Nigeria. And to add insult to the injury, higher grain prices will definitely put more pressure, on these economies. And we don't want to see, remember what happened last time when bread prices went up in Egypt. We saw the protests, from the people there for as little as bread. We've seen this happen many times. And if wheat prices go up, it's definitely going to transcend into, bread prices going up.
What the IMF does,
we have to deal with
borrowing conditions is what is heavily criticized.
Exactly, and they do have their issues at this point.
Central Bank of Nigeria raises MPC rates interest at first meeting under the President Tinubu administration.
Exactly.
Pray tell.
All eyes have been looking out for that meeting. That happened yesterday. Finally, we got the decision. Post, the suspended governor. So we did hear from the acting governor yesterday, and it was a rate hike, nonetheless, but not as major as we've seen in the past. Not 50 basis, not 75 basis points. It was 25 basis points because we're still dealing with high inflation. Right now, inflation for June came about 22.79%, even though some experts say it is much more than that, definitely, because we saw, the FX unification, we saw PMS prices go over 200% in June. So they believe that should have, factored into the inflation data we got. So, at the end of the day, they have to, try and close that gap, between, the rates and inflation rate. So they had to take it up. Just a minor 25 basis points, but at the end of the day, still adds to the cost of borrowing, issue for companies. So at the end of the day, it's what it is, and definitely we're looking out for the next meeting. Hopefully, inflation peaks at some point here in Nigeria.
We hope it translates to a better, cost, more comfortable cost of living for Nigerians.
Much lower, because you know how much we spend on fuel right now. It's crazy.
Indeed. Thank you, Ladi. Ladi Williams, our business correspondent, who you should join on Business Morning after the program. And finally, a Russian delegation led by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has arrived in North Korea to be joined by a Chinese delegation later on Wednesday. They will attend Pyongyang's celebrations of the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, marked typically by massive military parades. The visits are the first to North Korea since the country shut its borders in a bid to keep out the pandemic. It's unclear if this will signal a change in Pyongyang's border policy. The reclusive North Korea had sealed the country off from all trade and diplomatic ties in early 2020, even with Russia and China, which are its main economic and political partners. They even cut off imports of essential goods like food and medicine. North Korea has been facing food shortages, which have been made worse by its border closure and also strict international sanctions that have been imposed because of its nuclear program. That's it on today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks to our guests, our producers, and to you, our viewers, for being a part of it. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Please join us again tomorrow.